All right, let's jump right into the Fixplainer. I want you to imagine waking up not in the year 2026, but way, way back in the year 26 AD. There are no alarms going off, no phone sitting on your nightstand, no electricity, and definitely no internet. The very first thing you hear isn't a digital notification. It's the sound of roosters crowing, merchants outside getting their carts ready, and folks starting another day in the ancient world. Welcome to Daily Life 2,000 years ago. Today, we are traveling back in time to discover exactly how ordinary people lived, worked, ate, learned, and basically survived. And by the time we finish this journey, you might just realize that some parts of your life are vastly easier today, while other human experiences, well, they haven't really changed at all. So the most crucial thing to understand is that in 26 AD, your entire life and your whole workday were completely dictated by the rising and setting of the sun. Think about it. Artificial light was an incredibly expensive luxury. You couldn't just flick on an electric bulb. People relied on these small oil lamps that burned olive oil, and families had to save that oil really, really carefully for the nighttime. Sleeping in late? Yeah, that simply wasn't practical. The absolute second daylight appeared, you had to get up and get moving, because daylight was literally your most valuable resource. Now, let's look at where you'd be waking up, because there was a massive contrast in ancient housing. Let's take the Roman Empire, for example. If you were wealthy, you woke up in this sprawling, airy home built of stone and marble called a domus. You'd have this beautiful atrium with an indoor cooling pool, really thick walls to block out all the noisy city chaos, and just plenty of natural light. But if you were like most ordinary folks, you lived in what was called an insula. These were tall, cramped, noisy, and, to be honest, pretty filthy apartment buildings. Since they didn't have proper kitchens, poor families actually cooked their meals on these little portable grills. That meant the rooms were constantly filled with smoke. And because these buildings were mostly made of wood, they were highly prone to catching fire. It was a dense, smoky, and genuinely dangerous way to live. Okay, let's grab some breakfast. And this massive class and cultural divide extended right down to that first meal of the day. In Rome, the working class relied heavily on what were essentially ancient fast food joints called thermopolia. You'd grab a quick, cheap bowl of porridge made from barley or wheat, maybe grab a piece of bread, and just get on with your day. But halfway across the world in ancient India, the approach to food was totally different. It was deeply connected to seasonal balance. Folks over there ate these incredibly nourishing meals featuring millet roti, warm lentil soups made from moong or tur dal, and seasonal veggies like bottle gourds or bitter gourds. And remember, this was long before tomatoes, potatoes, or chilies were even introduced to the region. It was a diet absolutely perfectly designed to provide energy and support digestion naturally. So what about the kids? Well, for children in ancient Rome, the morning routine depended entirely on how much money their family had. If you were privileged enough to actually attend school, your day started early. You'd carry your supplies in a leather shoulder bag, maybe stopping at a local breakfast bar for some beans and nuts. Inside the classroom, you'd use a stylus, basically a pointed pen, to scratch your Greek and Latin lessons into small wooden boards covered in wax. When you finished, you just used the flat end of the stylus to rub the wax smooth again. It was super strict, and mistakes were severely punished. But for the vast majority of poor children, school just wasn't a thing. They learned trades like leatherworking or were sent out to work the fields from a really young age. And just as education was strictly controlled, so was the rigid social order of the time, especially when it came to gender. In the first century Roman world, women were legally bound to a male authority figure known as the paterfamilias, usually a father and later a husband. Women were largely excluded from political activity and voting. However, there were a few exceptions that really highlight the complexity of ancient life. Some women actually did manage to run their own businesses, taking on these rare careers as doctors, midwives, or even lamp makers. Plus, wealthy widows, who were no longer subject to a man's authority, could actually gain total independence and manage their own vast properties. So there were some workarounds, if you were lucky. By the afternoon, the intense physical toll of ancient labor might mean you needed to visit a doctor. And this is where things get wild. Obviously, modern antibiotics and sterile hospitals simply did not exist. A simple infection could easily turn deadly. But they weren't entirely without relief. Roman physicians actually had an informal pharmacopoeia of natural anesthetics. They used plants like the opium poppy, henbane, and mandrake root to dull the agony. Even so, undergoing a medical procedure back then was a completely harrowing ordeal that required immense personal resilience. But hey, we really shouldn't underestimate these ancient doctors. The Roman medical writer Celsus details surprisingly advanced surgical procedures in his texts. Just look at these exact steps for treating a severe abdominal wound. Celsus instructed surgeons to carefully examine the intestines for discoloration, to see if they were viable, bathe them in water if they were drying out, and most incredibly, to apply two distinct rows of stitches, one to the inner membrane and one to the surface skin. It just goes to show that while ancient life was brutal, their understanding of the human body and surgical techniques was remarkably sophisticated.
Okay, assuming you actually survived the doctor, you'd probably head straight to the marketplace. This was the absolute beating heart of any ancient city. I mean, forget the internet. The market was literally the social media hub of 26 AD. This is where the latest news spread, where friendships formed, and where arguments broke out. Wealthy women and their slaves navigated these packed stalls while merchants hawked absolutely everything. You'd see simple vegetables, clay jars of a super salty fish sauce called garum, all the way to exotic live monkeys and colorful birds meant to attract the wealthiest customers. It was loud, vibrant, and incredibly chaotic.
Now, for afternoon entertainment, since streaming your favorite show was a couple of millennia away, you had to find your fun out in the city. Emperors provided what they called bread and circuses to keep the masses happy and distracted. So you might join up to 200,000 screaming fans at the Circus Maximus. People from all different classes flocked there to watch these incredibly dangerous, often deadly chariot races. And here's a fun fact for you. Unlike the Colosseum, where men and women had to sit separately, at the Circus Maximus, they could actually sit together. Because of this, Roman poets literally considered the roaring, deadly chariot racetrack the absolute best place in the entire city to find a date. No way, right? As the day finally winds down and it's time for dinner, that massive class divide we talked about earlier becomes wildly apparent all over again. For a poor family, dinner was super simple. Maybe some chunks of local fish, a bit of asparagus, and a fig for dessert. But for the wealthy, dinner was an absolute theatrical display of status. Wealthy Romans hosted these extravagant feasts featuring bizarre delicacies. We're talking mice cooked in honey, roasted parrots stuffed with dates, snails dipped in milk, and even salted jellyfish. Quite the menu, right? So dinner wraps up, the last of those little oil lamps starts to flicker out, and we are faced with a pretty terrifying reality of daily life in 26 AD. What happens when the sun goes down? Well, the ancient world plunged into absolute pitch black darkness. Because there were no modern streetlights, the cities became incredibly dangerous at night. Roman police rarely patrolled the poor neighborhoods. Crime, assault, and theft were so rampant that some streets were entirely closed off after dark. The unlit alleys were so perilous that wealthy citizens who had to travel at night would intentionally leave their fine clothes behind. Actually, they would dress in dirty rags and old togas, just trying to blend in and hide their wealth so they wouldn't be robbed or murdered on their way home. Talk about a stressful commute. You know, that in the first century, St. Paul summed up this harsh reality for the vast majority of people with the phrase, "He who does not work shall not eat." It was a world where absolutely nothing was delivered to your door. Every single thing was earned through hard physical labor. Reflecting on this incredible journey back in time, seeing the crowded apartments, the brilliant yet brutal medical practices, and the absolute darkness of the night, it really leaves us with a provocative thought. Do you think you'd have the physical and mental resilience to survive in a world where every meal was a hard-fought victory, every sickness was a terrifying gamble, and every single sunset brought real danger? Definitely something to think about the next time you turn off your bedroom lamp